And we've been going through the topical studies of Suwannee County history like I mentioned to you. And today we're going to be looking at Wellborn, not Wellborn. You're not from here if you call it Wellborn, but Wellborn. But we've got to talk about the area before it became Wellborn. So we're going to talk about predecessor communities, if you will, in that area first. So we're going to look at George McClellan. We've got to talk about him as we talk about the Wellborn area history. He was a very early settler of what's now Suwannee County, well before it was Suwannee County. The E in the George E. McClellan, the E is usually listed as Edmund for his middle name. I've seen a couple references to perhaps Edward, but I think Edmund is the middle name, and I'll tell you why in a few minutes. But he was born either in South Carolina or Georgia on July 11th, 1808, depends on the source. But 1808, he moved to Florida, which was still a territory prior to 1830. And we know that because he was clerk of court for Hamilton County. So basically my boss's job over in Hamilton County. Hamilton County was a lot earlier county than Suwannee was. So he was clerk of court in Hamilton County early on, but then he very shortly after moved to what's now Suwannee County. At the time it was pretty much part of Columbia County in the 1830s. And he constructed a home just south of modern day Wellborn, which again did not exist at that point. And his original plantation was about 560 acres, but over the years he was able to add on to it, and it got up to about over 2,000 acres. So decent sized plantation there. He married Sidney Taylor prior to 1831, and they had 10 children that I know of, that the records show. His home became kind of a stopping point on the old Spanish Trail, which basically was the first highway in Florida, basically for stagecoaches, on the old stagecoach route, if you will. And it was a stopping point because they would stop there, they would trade out horses that had been worn out from their trip over land, and also because the Seminole Indians lived in this area in the 1830s and 1840s. You had to deal with Indian attacks, so periodically a home was used as basically a first aid station for folks that were injured by the Indians. So anyway, that's where his home came to become like a center, if you will, community center of sorts. And he eventually established a post office in his home, multi-purpose house, you know. And he called it Little River. And he called it Little River because there was a lake that he had named after himself, or was named after him anyway, called McClellan Lake. But it had a little river, if you will, that flowed into what is now called Wellborn Lake to the north. And so he called the post office Little River. So that is the name of the community that was developed around his house, Little River. Now we'll talk about it in a little bit, in several slides, but the interesting thing was, this was the 1830s with this Little River. In the 1880s, there'd be another Little River established about 5 or 10 miles south of this location. So different locations, same name. Sometimes that happens. It was closer to the McAlpin area. His main source of income was his plantation. The records show in 1850 that he had 14 slaves between the ages of 6 and 62. So he was one of the many slave owners in the South pre-Civil War. But he did lots of other things. Besides being clerk of court over in Hamilton County for a bit, he served as the probate judge for our area from 1841 to 1845, again when we were part of Columbia County. And then he served as a representative in the Florida legislature after we became a state. Suwannee County was established in 1858, and upon the establishment, he became one of our first county surveyors. So he knew about surveying also, so multi-talented, lots of different things that he did. And at that point, surveyors were an important part of a new county because they helped lay out the groundwork for what would become communities and towns sometimes. Or just laying out the property for sale for other folks. George's wife, Sidney, passed away on July 7th, 1860, and very shortly after he married a woman named Celestia Relief Holman. And they had one child, and this was a girl, and her name was Edmonia, which is why I think his middle name was Edmund. Named the girl after his middle name, just make it female. So Edmonia, she was born in May of 1862, but then she died 9 months later, so she didn't live to maturity. And half of his kids actually did not. He actually died after half of his kids did, but that was a time of higher mortality especially on the frontiers, as you will. During the Civil War, he was getting up into his 50s, but he still served for the South as a captain in the Confederate Army. And the existing records that we have at the courthouse, even today, show him to be a very prominent, very wealthy merchant. During the Civil War, as times were tough for those in the area, he would donate food, goods, basically what people needed to be able to survive in those tough times of the Civil War. So he died in October of 1866. He's buried in what's called the McClellan Cemetery, which is on Sierra 137 south of the US 90 interchange. His first wife was there, and most of his children are there. 5 of his 11 children died before him, so it's unfortunate. It's just one of those things that happen. So that's George McClellan. So he was one of the early settlers of what's now the Wellborn area. Good morning or good afternoon, y'all. Other early settler that we'll talk about in a few more minutes after this was William Clemens. William Clemens, and there's a couple different ways to spell it. I've seen it Clements with one N, Clements with 2 M's. But basically he was a very early pioneer. I don't know too much about him other than by the last half of the 1830s he was living in the Little River, Wellborn area. He was married to a woman named Rebecca. Her maiden name was Whitten, and they had 4 living children by the 1830s, early 1840s. One of them's name was Clary, another was John, then Susan, and Mary. Another source said they had 5 kids that survived. Survived being a baby anyway. It's probable that William Clemens is this same gentleman here, the W. Clements or William Clements, that petitioned for and was given authorization for a ferry across the Suwannee River at a place called Harrington's Ferry. And that was in 1832, I believe. Yeah, January 25th, 1832. Florida was still a territory, and a territorial council in this case gave him a 5-year ferry, basically allowance for that. But not long thereafter, a few days later, basically, they rescinded it. What they probably figured out was, oh, there's already another ferry close enough. Because normally what they would do is they would try not to put a ferry or closer than 5 to 7 miles from one another to allow each one of them to have some source of income. You didn't want to have too much competition. So I'm guessing that's probably what it was. When the council went back, they realized we've got another ferry, maybe Charles Ferry or something like that. That was too close. So they rescinded that approval. It also looks like the Clemens and the Carvers were married. The Carvers, we still have Carvers even today in this county, but they were a very early family of settlers, and they also originally lived in the Little River, Wellborn area. Well, everything's going along fine. These people are coming in, people are moving into the Little River area, and then we've got something called the Second Seminole War. There are 3 Seminole Wars fought in Florida between 1818 and 1858, I believe is when the last one ends. The first, second, and third. Makes it easy to figure it out. The Second Seminole War was fought from 1835 to 1842. It was actually the United States' longest war until Vietnam, basically. Most of the battles in this war, which was fought entirely in Florida, were south of the Suwannee Valley area. I mean, it's not really up here. The big battles were down in the other Withlacoochee River area, what's now Sumter County, Tampa, that area, Central Florida, basically. But we still had several incidents up here in Suwannee County, especially raids by Seminoles. They would come in and they would attack families when they were basically unprepared, and several massacres we had happen. William Clemens, his family, his wife and children were among those who huddled with a lot of the other pioneer families, basically in either forts or ad hoc forts. Just it's a big house or a big building that people could fortify a little bit. They weren't forts per se that you think of today, or forts like over St. Augustine, the Castillo de San Marcos. Nothing like that. Basically just a house. It might have had some sticks out, a fence with the sharpened poles at the end of it, kind of maybe keep some of the Seminoles from attacking. Maybe have a few soldiers stationed there. But Clemens' family was one of them stationed in one of those forts. Richard Tillis was another early settler of the Wellborn, Little River area. His family was probably there too. Meanwhile, soldiers from the United States are looking for Seminoles that are still in this area. They're trying to push them further down south, but there are still many Seminoles roaming the woods, if you will. And the Florida militia was also called up. So what we call the National Guard today, Florida militia back then. So they were called up also to assist. And so a lot of these men that I'm talking about entered service in, if not the Army, the full-blown Army, they were in the Florida militia. So people like William Clemens, Richard Tillis, George McClellan, some other folks, they basically became part of the militia units. For instance, the 1st Regiment, the 2nd Brigade was one of those that was a local unit of the Florida militia that was used to basically protect settlers and to search for the enemy Seminoles. Let's see, George McClellan, Andrew McClellan, his brother, William H. Rousseau, who was a very early settler. Rousseau was the guy that named Live Oak, probably. Several Carvers, several Mateers, Willoughby Tillis, who was Richard's brother, Richard Tillis's or Dick Tillis's brother, Willoughby. I mean, a lot of folks, mainly from the Wellborn, Little River area, but also the Suwannee Springs, because we didn't have a ton of settlers, to be honest, in what's now Suwannee County. You know, several dozen families, a few hundred people tops was in what's now Suwannee County in the 1830s and the 1840s. So you pretty much knew about everybody that you were serving with, because they might live down the road 5 miles, but they were your closest neighbors. So those kinds of things. They were part of what was called Captain William Reed's company, and they were stationed in and around Fort Gilliland, which was in Newnansville, which is, you can say, Gainesville today, close enough to be Gainesville. September 4th, 1836, I saw a letter where they had 128 soldiers that were stationed there at Fort Gilliland. And a lot of them actually fought in the Battle of Wahoo Swamp, November 21st, 1836. These guys that we're talking about from the Wellborn area, Little River area, where they distinguished themselves. And the interesting thing is, General Richard Call, who was in charge of the Florida militia, because he was also the governor, he was commander-in-chief of the militia, this guy here, Governor Call / General Call, he actually led them personally in battle. Not just the Florida militia, but also some Tennessee volunteers, Creek mercenaries, and even some U.S. Army forces. The battle was an unsuccessful attack upon Indians in what's now Sumter County. Back then it was called the Cove of the Withlacoochee. It was basically an area of woods and swamps where a lot of the Seminoles were massing and they would attack from. Nowadays it's been dredged out, there's a lake and stuff there. It's not like what it was 180, 90 years ago. But basically he was leading from the front, literally, charging with his men. Kind of weird today to think about that. You can't think of, I can't see a governor or the president doing that today, but different times, different times. Different times. Back then, that's when they were leading from the front. So the Second Seminole War is happening, and the next several slides I'll talk about, just remember that that war is still going on in Florida. There are still battles, there are still massacres. But meanwhile, people are trying to live as best a semblance of life as they can. One of the things that happens is in 1838, they call a constitutional convention to decide if the territory of Florida should become a state. They look at 5 different sites to be able to hold this meeting from across the whole territory. One of the 5 sites actually they look at is Suwannee Springs, but they didn't choose Suwannee Springs. They actually chose Port St. Joe, or St. Joseph, which is now modern-day Port St. Joe, in Panhandle a little bit, not too far from here. There were 56 men who attended the convention from all over the territory. One of them was George E. McClellan. Again, he was very big, not just here locally, but he was big enough and had been in the House, getting the House of Representatives, those kinds of things, territorial things. That he was asked to attend the convention. Some sources said that he delivered the keynote address, but when I went there and talked to them, they said we don't have any record of him doing that. So one of those hearsay things that may or may not be true. But the proposed state constitution, they came back with one. They brought it to the voters, and the voters basically, in 1839, the election was 2,072 in favor of becoming a state, 1,953 opposed. So basically 120 votes separated yes from no. Columbia County, which included Suwannee County at that point, showed basically a larger margin wanted to stay territory for some reason. Don't know why, but they did. And I mean, that's just what happened. Some of the votes in this area were thrown out. They were irregular. Sometimes it was because they had put no state instead of no constitution, just some antics and some other things. But basically, it passed, but it was not overwhelming by any means. It was threadbare margins. But because of the war and other things going on, even though it was 1839, the voters approved to become a state, it was 6 more years in 1845 before Florida actually did become a state. That's a picture over from Port St. Joe at the Constitutional Museum that's there today. So back to the Seminole War that's continuing to go on throughout all of that. This is a map of northern Florida, which is where a lot of the fighting was happening, was down around here. It's down Wahoo Swamp, this area down here. There's Fort Micanopy, which is now Micanopy, lots of different places that you will probably recognize today. A lot of those roads that you see on the map were established by the military to be able to connect forts to one another, easily get from one place to the other. There was a Columbia County pioneer who lived in Lake City, what's now Lake City area, named George Gillett Keene, and he published a reminiscence about his life. And he actually talked about a fort in the Wellborn area called Fort Jinks. I don't know anything else about it, I haven't found any information, but supposedly there was a fort basically in the Wellborn area, probably in or close to George McClellan's house, I'm just guessing. Since his house seemed to be the kind of center of things, it's the post office and all the other stuff, so probably close to where his house was today in modern day Wellborn area, or Little River, Little Springs at that point. Little River. But again, these forts were just kind of more name only. And after the Second Seminole War ended, most of these forts were abandoned or went back to their original purpose or torn down for parts. There basically aren't any forts from the Second Seminole War around. There are a couple of reconstructions. I think Fort Christmas down further south is a recreation on the original site of the fort, but basically those forts were just temporary, just something to keep people safe in the meantime. But you've also got other relics of the Second Seminole War. A lot of these forts, maybe the fort didn't survive, but the people that had moved there for shelter maybe stayed there, and then they became communities. So that's why you have places like Fort White, Fort Lauderdale. They were forts during the Second Seminole War. So there's that lasting monument, if you will, to those fort locations. So 1835 is when the Second Seminole War started. In 1842, the war is basically about to be over. The United States military forces had pretty much pushed most of the Seminoles out of North and Central Florida. Most of them have been shipped off to Oklahoma Territory, which was the Indian Territory at the time. Some of them have gone down to South Florida, where nobody would ever want to live, according to the United States government at that point. They could have the swamps and all that stuff in the south part of Florida. But there were still a few in the area that were still unknown, and they were not able to locate them at that time. So by 1842, these families that had been struggling to survive forts or things like that off and on for several years are basically starting to make their way back home. Things are looking good. They're trying to rebuild their lives, but not all the Seminoles were gone, and not all of them were still friendly. And so one of the families is the family of Richard Tillis. He and his wife Elizabeth and their family returns to Little River and basically start rebuilding their house, or had their house survived or they rebuilt it. But Richard or Dick Tillis, one day on February 24th, 1842, he is away from his house, either moving household property, out chopping wood out in the boondocks. Basically, his wife and his children are back at the house. Well, the Seminoles decide that's a good place to attack, so they basically attack and massacre most of the family. Most of the kids are killed or badly injured. The wife is killed, and lots of bad things happen. Basically, George McClellan is in the process of having a new house built. Probably maybe it was burned down, we don't know. But some slaves that are working on that house notice some of the Seminoles traveling along one of the trails, so they get back to George McClellan and others and say, hey, we've got Indians in the neighborhood, we got to get rid of them. And so McClellan organizes the militia real quick, the local settlers. They start going house to house to find out if everybody's okay. Well, they get to the Tillis household and they see smoke building from the chimney, smoke coming out of the front door. They come across what's left of the family, been massacred almost to a man. A couple of the kids are still alive, but they're badly injured. But Elizabeth, which is Dick Tillis's wife, is killed. Two of the kids are killed, and actually two of her sister's kids are killed, which Dick Tillis had married one sister, had some kids. She had died. He then married the other sister, or another sister. And now the second wife is now killed too. So I've got right here, this talks about the Tillis massacre, shows basically where it was on that map. But again, Little River / Wellborn area. They are buried in the Carver Cemetery, which today is located just in Columbia, inside Columbia County. But that's where most of these people are buried. This is a report from the New York weekly journal called The New World, and it was written in the March 19, 1842 edition, and it talks about the Tillis massacre, and that's right after it talked about another massacre that had happened a few miles west of the Suwannee River. So George McClellan on the 28th, so basically a couple days after the massacre happens, he writes a letter to the governor, Governor Call. So he says, to His Excellency R.K. Call, Governor of Florida, sir, it is with feelings of the deepest regret that I am compelled to inform you of one of the most barbarous acts of Indian depredation. On Thursday last at noon, 7 or 8 Indians were discovered in a half or 3/4 of a mile of my house, making towards a neighboring house. I immediately sent a runner to that house to apprise them, and through the neighborhood for the same purpose, but before the news could reach around a Mr. Richard Tully or Tillis family about 2 miles from me, he being absent on business, fell victims to their barbarity in the following distressing manner. The lady, Mrs. T, was shot dead. A young lady who was staying there attempted to run off with Mrs. T's infant, 2 weeks old, but was run after by an Indian, overtaken, knocked down with the limb of a tree, and stabbed under each arm, or nearly so, to the hollow. She is yet alive. A little girl, 8 years old, was shot with an arrow in the back, the barber's spike made of iron, severing off part of the bone and lodging under a rib. She died last night. A little boy, 6 years old, was shot with an arrow in the back near the bone and came out near the navel. He is yet alive. The next oldest was killed dead with an arrow, and the next oldest boy was shot through the body and died on Friday night. All of the children were shot and the arrows left in them, except the infant, which was not interrupted. The house was stripped and the Indians made their escape. I pursued them the next day with 24 men, but did not overtake them till they had crossed the Suwannee. And on the opposite bank they were discovered, but out of gunshot, and no possibility of crossing the river. Thus were we disappointed of revenge. The steamboat that came after the troops at Fort McComb was located downriver on the Suwannee River, as I am told, on its return discovered, or the men on her saw, Indian rafts on this side of the river, and neither destroyed them, pursued the Indians, nor informed us of it. However, Major Raines at Fort White came with a doctor from that fort to see the wounded of Tillis' family, or Tillis, and promised to do all in his power for us. On receiving information of this murder, he sent for aid to Camp Fanning, and a company of dragoons, which are cavalry basically, were immediately or as soon as possible and returned to Camp F to recross the river and come up after them. But alas, it is too late. They cannot, I fear, overtake them. Yesterday, about 10 in the morning, they made an attack on Mr. Osteen's house, 1.5 miles from the Natural Bridge on the Santa Fe River, killed Mrs. O, and was still firing on the house when the express left for Alligator. Alligator was what Lake City was called at that time. The particulars of this transaction are yet to be learned. I fear the worst. I start up again tomorrow after them. Signs were discovered within a few miles of this 1 day since. Unless we get aid speedily, the country must be abandoned. Not a soldier is on the frontier of the country except at Fort White, leaving Santa Fe and Suwannee free for them to live on. This is protection. I have stated this much that you may be correctly informed of matters in this vicinity. Hoping to hear from you soon. And you, sir, your obedient servant, signed George E. McClellan. So George McClellan was not happy about the military not protecting the citizens of this area. And as a result of that, several folks died, not just here in what's now Suwannee County, but across the border in Columbia County. So lots of people are getting massacred in the Suwannee Valley region, if you will. But a lot of them are happening in what's now the Wellborn area, or Little River at that time. It's very sad. But the war does finally end later on in 1842. The last of the Seminoles moved either to Oklahoma or down to South Florida. Again, where the American government said, we don't want that area at all, we're never going to live down there, you can have the swamps. And we know what happened after that, which was the Third Seminole War. And then they got pushed out of there for the most part. Interesting thing, kind of aside, not really part of this presentation, but we're talking about Dick Tillis. His brother Willoughby, I mentioned as somebody else who lived here. After the Second Seminole War, he moved his family down to South Florida. And lo and behold, in the Third Seminole War, there's a battle fought in his house. He loses a son in that battle. So it kind of reminds me of the Civil War with Wilmer McLean, who basically, the first battle, Bull Run, was fought in his front yard, and then the war ended in his parlor. It was kind of like Willoughby Tillis was trying to get away from the fighting up here, went down there, and then he has a fight in his house again. So interesting. Anyway, I make side comments all the time. Historical tidbits. There we go. Informational Jeopardy questions for you. Anyway, the war ends. More people start moving into this area, and so by 1845, Florida becomes a state, and this area continues to grow. You can see how Columbia County was at that point, and by the 1850s anyway. The Florida legislature, which had replaced the territorial council now that we were a state, there were several times where they were looking at establishing new counties. Sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't. One of the discussions was to create a new county off of the western side of Columbia County. There were now enough people that had moved in. Alligator/Lake City, the county seat, was kind of far from some of these folks to go. And so in 1855, they heavily discussed creating a new county called Suwannee. They were naming it after the Suwannee River, which surrounded it on three sides. And in the proposal that they were looking at, they were going to create also Taylor County, named after one of the former generals who later would become president, Zachary Taylor. And so they talked about it in a lot of detail. On Tuesday, December 11th, 1855, it went in the Senate. They had a lot of discussion. It had already been approved by the House of Representatives, so it was getting close. They were going to have 3 readings of it. The first 2 readings, it was made to refer it to a committee, and it passed. The third vote was held on December 12th, 1855. Final vote was 8 in favor, 9 against. So by one person, Suwannee did not become a county in 1855. Basically, the folks up on the north side of the area, the north side of Florida, wanted one. The other folks, the south part, didn't want it. Politics and all that good stuff. Taylor County would be established in 1856, but it was 3 years before Suwannee would become a new county. So eventually, the petition came back for a county, but between that, before that happened, a couple other things happened. Just a year or so after that original petition almost became Suwannee County, there was a petition in the legislature to establish a mail route from the house of George McClellan's on Little River in Columbia County to Shoaltown on the Suwannee River via Samuel Barber's and William Johnson's, a distance of 30 miles. So they were still establishing post office routes. More and more people were moving into this area. Little River continued to even have a post office through the Civil War. On some of the old maps of the Civil War era, it says Little River, PA. So, but Little River's days as a community were numbered. It wouldn't be too much longer before it pretty much went away. Finally, in 1858, 3 years after the initial proposal barely failed, the new proposal came up, and so they proposed to establish a new county out of the western side of Columbia County, and they created Suwannee County. They also created New River County. Anybody know where New River County is? It was renamed a few years later after the first Florida officer, I believe, killed in the Civil War, Bradford. So Bradford County was originally New River. And if you go over there, you'll actually cross over the New River to get into it from Columbia County. So they established it December 21st, 1858. At the same time, Suwannee County had about 200 families. So not a ton of people, but that was 200 families. So maybe 1,000 folks tops in Suwannee County. Elections were held in April of 1859. They elected a judge of probate, who was also the county judge at that point. The clerk of the circuit court, sheriff, coroner, county coroner used to be an elected position. I mean, you got a dead body show up, you got to figure out who done it, kind of thing, or if it was natural. So a county coroner, also a county surveyor, again, to help plot these new lands for these people coming in. The assessor and collector of taxes, and we only had 4 county commissioners originally. Now we have 5. The temporary county seat was designated as the House of William Hines. You won't see it in that page, it's on the next page of that. But the House of William Hines, he was our first judge. He was a slave owner, 24 slaves. The land that I have found that he owned in our county records was basically where Nobles Ferry Road crosses the interstate. Basically in that area. Townsend Farms, somewhere in that area was where he had property anyway that I found. So that's very possible that's where it was. This is the first map that I have found that shows Suwannee as its own county. You can still see places like Charles Ferry there on the left-hand center, which by this point is starting to wane. The Charles family, most of them have been killed by the Indians before this, or others. But it's still there. So a crossing point, you've got Columbus at the top left, which is now the Suwannee River State Park, and you've got Little River there on the right-hand side. It's showing the proposed route of the railroad that was starting to be built at this point. It actually would go a little bit north of Little River, not right there where it's showing. Some of our early records that we still have at the courthouse today. This is one early one, and this is a judgment from early 1858, and it's actually shortly before Suwannee became a county, but I guess the court case was still going on. So when Suwannee became a county, the record was transferred to us, which is why I've got it today. It was a judgment filed against Andrew McClellan, who was the brother of George McClellan, who lived in the Wellborn area, Little River area. And it was a judgment for $61.26. Over the years, as I've done this presentation, my boss is a relative or a descendant of Andrew McClellan. And so I would joke about him about how much he owes the county with all that interest compounded. Last time I did it a couple years ago, it was something like $50,000 or $60,000. If it was compounded monthly at 5%. So, if he didn't pay, Andrew McClellan will probably eventually pay. This is one of the earlier records I have, or oldest records anyway, that I have at the courthouse. But the oldest thing I've got, kind of another side note, but just FYI. The oldest thing I've got at the courthouse at the clerk's office is from 1848. So that's 3 years after Florida became a state, 10 years before we became a county. And they're actually results of cases that were held before the Florida Supreme Court. They're called Florida Reports. And so I've got volume 2 of the Florida reports from the Supreme Court cases. So it's kind of interesting to go back and see some of the cases they were dealing with this new state and these new things needing to be decided. So very interesting. You know, almost 180 years worth of records at our courthouse. Of course, sometimes when I touch stuff, it's like, what funky disease did I just get? So I wash my hands a lot. But, you never know. Spreading that smallpox around. But it's very interesting. I mean, these folks are long gone, and just reading some of their records, I love looking at them. So you saw a drawing of it a minute ago, but the Pensacola and Georgia Railroad was the first railroad to come through Suwannee County. The construction really began about 1857, more towards Tallahassee and towards the Jacksonville area, as another road that was going to be connected with that railroad. Let's see, it was completed in 1861. Basically, right as the Civil War starts, that railroad is finally completed. It went from Tallahassee, just past Tallahassee, all the way to Jacksonville, but it really met up in Lake City with the Atlantic and Gulf Railroad, which is the one coming from Jacksonville. But they met up, they used the same line, those kinds of things. One of the civil engineers that was working in and around Suwannee County to lay out that railroad was a guy by the name of Lewis Wellborn DuBose. Spelled different ways. If you were French, you'd say Dubois, but from the other spellings I've seen, I think he pronounced Dubose. One of the old stories I've heard, I've read before, I've actually passed it on in writing before myself, is that the railroad, in appreciation for his help, basically granted him 162 acres in what's now Wellborn. That's actually not true. You know, like I said, I've said that before myself. Upon some further digging, going through our records, what we find is he actually bought 240 acres on January 16, 1860 from the state of Florida, which owned a lot of the property in Suwannee County at that point. And he paid a whole whopping $1.25 an acre, which adjusted for inflation is about $50.15. I looked it up yesterday. Yeah, good luck. I wish. I'd have my own $1,000 or 1,000-acre home if I had that. But
acres 10,000 now.
oh, at least, yeah, in the farmland kind of stuff. Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, when I was graduating high school, it was $250 an acre, and I kicked myself every day that I didn't buy a few dozen acres when I had a little bit of money. Not that I've ever had a lot of money, but you know, before the kids come along and all that kind of stuff, you have a little bit more. But you know, now it's a lot more, obviously. So, Louis Wellborn Dubose quickly plats out, because he's an engineer, he plats out the community of Wellborn. Here's the actual copy from the official records for the deed books that shows the original plat. And it's spelled a couple different ways. Obviously, W-E-L-L-B-O-R-N is what we call it today. But some records spell it with one L and with a U instead of an O. And some of them have a B-O-U-R-N. So just sounds good enough. Let me write it down. It sounds good enough for government work. So I see different spellings of stuff. But he platted it out, and he did not retain ownership of this property long. He basically platted it out and probably made, I have to go back and look, but probably made a good bit of money after he platted it out and sold those acreage to lots of folks, like over a dozen families that I saw within a year. So he bought the property cheap, started selling it off to folks. The McLaren family was one of those that bought a lot of that property. They became very prominent in Wellborn's history, and a lot of other folks. By 1860 or 1865, depending on the record, the first post office in Wellborn is established. Jesse M. McLaren was the first postmaster. Like I said, 1860 or 1865. I've seen both. So now we've got Little River, just a couple miles south of it. That's been around for 30 years by this point, almost. And now you've got Wellborn, 2 miles away, more or less, just north of it. Meanwhile, in the vicinity, in the area around Wellborn and Little River, you got other folks who are living and dying. One of those is a gentleman by the name of Thomas Dexter. This picture is either of Thomas Dexter or of his son Horatio, or Horace F. Fillmore Dexter. Not sure who it is, but it's one of those two guys, father or son. Dexter, when the Civil War started, was our largest slave owner. He had 53 slaves near, just north of Wellborn, at what's now the IFAS location, just off CR 136. Basically, that lake on the IFAS area is called Dexter Lake. It was his lake. He was born in around 1814 in Rhode Island. He died October 21st, 1862. During the Second Seminole War, he lived in this area. He was serving with William Ross's company in the area. He became postmaster of Lower Mineral Springs, which is now called Suwannee Springs. And he was postmaster in 1846. And then a place called St. Helena in 1857. Not quite sure where that was, except it was in the neighborhood. He also ran the Jacksonville Courier for a little while after the original editor died in 1835. So he started running it later in 1835 for a little while. He died in 1862 as a result of a cotton gin house fire. And we know that for a few different reasons. I've got some records on it at the courthouse, but there's some history on that from some of the former slaves that lived there, actually. His wife was named Mary Ann Dexter. And when Thomas Dexter died and when the Civil War ended in 1865, slavery was outlawed, of course. And so Mrs. Dexter offered her slaves, hey, if you stay here, I'll let you keep half the income. Every one of them left. They didn't like her They liked him. They didn't like her. One of the records said he was from the north, she was from the south, and that was why. But there was a gentleman by the name of Claude Augustus Wilson. He was born a slave in 1857 on Thomas Dexter's plantation near Alligator, which again is Lake City. Dexter was a merchant as well as a large slave owner. I'm quoting from this book. Wilson regarded his master as a kindly man and thought Dexter's alleged Yankee ancestry responsible. On the other hand, the master's wife, Mary Ann Dexter, was a Southerner, said to be just the opposite. Although Wilson was only 8 years old when the slaves were freed, he remembers the Dexter plantation as being a large operation where the slaves worked under a driver from dawn to dusk. Wilson worked in the fields as a boy while his mother and sister worked in the Dexter mansion. Wilson said that his mother was rebellious and harassed the missus until she was allowed to work in the fields so she could be near her man. Wilson also recalled that Tom Dexter died from injuries caused from the gin house fire. This was during the Civil War period, and the slaves were apprehensive over the thought of the hated mistress being in charge of the plantation. When peace came, Mrs. Dexter informed the slaves that they could stay on the plantation if they so desired, keep after what they raised, and unstayed. Then Claude himself, another discussion I'm talking about him, stated that Dexter was horribly burned in the gin house fire and even swelled up so much that he died. And this is the quote: "His master did not go to war, but remain on the plantation." And this quote is coming from the 1930s, basically when FDR came into office, trying to put people back to work. A lot of civil projects. One of them was to basically go around and interview surviving slaves. Granted, a lot of them by that point had died, so you had a lot of the younger ones who were just kids when the war ended. But we're talking about 70 plus years later. So this former slave was being interviewed. I think he lived in Lake City at the time. But he said, but the person writing it down said his master did not go to war but remained on the plantation. One day at noon during the war, the gin house was seen to be on fire. One of the slaves rushed in and found the master badly burned and writhing in pain. He was taken from the building and given first aid, but his body being burned in oil and so badly burned it burst open. Thus ended the life of the kindly master of Claude. So bad ending for this guy, who the slaves even liked apparently. But he lived in, again, the Wellborn area, just north and I guess northwest of Wellborn per se, off 136. Suwannee County map from 1864. There was an issue as the war continued. There were other things not war related going on. In November of 1863, there was a decision by the Florida legislature to correct the boundary line between Suwannee and Columbia counties. Basically, there was a discussion as to Wellborn, because it was pretty much on the county line. Are the citizens of Wellborn citizens of Suwannee County or Columbia County? So they basically adjusted the line so that everybody that lived in Wellborn would be Suwannee County citizens. So it just was problematic because they had a couple of adjustments over the years. Some folks didn't know which county they lived in. It's an imaginary line, and you don't just like fly a plane and oh, there's the line right there between the counties. Moving on, this is a map made by the United States military who was fighting against Florida and the rest of the South at this point. So their information is not as up to date or accurate as it could be. For instance, you don't see Live Oak on this map. It would be right here basically, but it's not there, even though Live Oak had existed by this point since at least 1861. The Pensacola and Georgia Railroad is red. That makes it easy to find. You can see Columbus in the top left, and you can see Little River, PO. So it's still there. You can see Houston, which is the county seat. So it's got a lot of the communities, but not all of them. But it's showing Little River, and you see it's a couple miles south of that railroad, which is pretty much true. By the end of the Civil War, Wellborn is continuing to grow. More and more people are moving in there. That railroad access made it a whole lot easier to get there. There's a stop there. I can get off. I can plop down right here and buy up some property. Meanwhile, Little River, especially after George McClellan's death in 1866, is withering away. The people are moving into Wellborn or moving to Live Oak or Houston and some other places. And that community basically just fades away. It's on maps up until 1874. but by then Wellborn had been eclipsing it for 10 plus years. 1860s and 1870s, Wellborn had a good number of citizens. I don't know for sure exactly how many at that point, but they did have a good bit. And I know that because when the school board, the Suwannee County School Board was established and first met, 1869, and that was because of an act of the Florida legislature in that same year creating basically public schools, public boards of instruction. Before that time, basically it was more or less private, or you did it at your house, or you hired private tutors. But then they established a public school system throughout the state of Florida. When the school board met in September of that year, first time they had a quorum, they authorized 2 schools in Suwannee County as public schools. One was Live Oak, county seat by that point. The other was Wellborn. So that tells me Wellborn had a good bit of folks there. From that point on, there were a whole lot more schools being established. At one point we had about 100. Most of them being one room, schoolhouses with 5 or 10 kids. But Wellborn was one of the first 2 public ones selected. So I would think that says that there were a lot of folks there. A few years later, 1884, there was a statistical newspaper from New York City, and it showed Suwannee County as having 18 post offices around the communities. The 3 major communities were Live Oak, Branford, and then Wellborn. So Wellborn was a pretty good size, bigger than any other ones. Same source, mid-1800s to early 1900s, it said that Wellborn had 250 families, either inside of the limits or within a couple miles, easy traveling distance. Say 10 miles, 10-mile radius, 250 families. So that was a good bit for Suwannee County at the time. Had lots of orchards. This was when we still had orange groves and whatnot. One of the largest ones in the county was owned by W.A. Tyson of Wellborn area. And he also served in a lot of government positions. This is before we had some hard freezes. 1886, 1894, 1895, and then 1899 basically wiped out all of our orange crops. So they started putting them further and further down south. So unfortunately what it is. We also in Wellborn in the late 1800s had a hotel there, and a lot of northerners would come down and visit. Of course, we had places like Suwannee Springs and others. Very soon Hudson upon the Suwannee, which is now Dowling Park, would have resorts. People would come from all over the world to go visit. Well, one of the places they would stop through was at Wellborn a lot of the times. Wellborn Lake, which is there today in Wellborn, in that area. A lot of people would basically, especially northerners, come there, stay the winter, stay on the lake, be able to see that and use that. The town became a major shipping point for poultry, eggs, cotton, grain, and vegetables. By the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, there was actually a spur that ran from Wellborn, a railroad spur from Wellborn up to White Springs. So that allowed even more traffic. The Camp family up in the White Springs area, they were able to use it for lumber manufacturing, all those kinds of things. The old Little River had died, but then in about 1880, east of McAlpin, you can see it on that map, right here, you have a new river, a new little river pop up. It had a population of 75 in 1886, 2 sawmills, a grist mill, and an academy, and it had what was called honey peaches, which for a little bit of time were grown there and were very popular. So 1880s, early 1890s, you've got this other little river apparently, unless the guy was really off on his maps, and lots of other folks copied him, and it was the same little river. It doesn't appear to be though. It looks like it was another river further down south. So back to Wellborn itself, the old McLaren store, one of the oldest buildings in Suwannee County that I know of. There's 1 or 2 I can think of off the top of my head that are older, and there are probably more I'm not thinking of, but it was there by 1878 as a 1-story looking building, but then they added on by 1884. There's a couple pictures showing it both ways. Very old, very historic structure in downtown, if you will, Wellborn. And then there's some period photographs. It's a map circa 1900. Late 1800s, early 1900s was pretty much the heyday of Wellborn. Lots of businesses. They had grist mills, cotton mills, general merchandise, board houses, saloons, physicians, drugstores, blacksmiths, coopers, shoemakers, library, stables, sawmills, and a millinery, all in and around the immediate downtown Wellborn area. So lots of different stores. They had lots of farms. The population density by the early 1900s had not changed much. Live Oak was still the largest community, then Branford, then Wellborn. Wellborn was, apparently, from all the records I've been able to find and other people have been able to find, Wellborn was probably the first community with brick paving in Suwannee County. You see a portion of it even today. They're on the right. Brick paving. That was the old US 90, if you will. Built sometime in 1917, according to the Suwannee Democrat article I found. And at that point, the Wellborn citizens were asking that it be connected to the east-west running clay road that Suwannee County had, which was basically US 90 today. So let's connect there with our nice brick road to your clay road. Try to look. You see black on that left-hand side of that map. All those black lines are various railroads going through Suwannee County. So we have a lot of them, a lot of different ones. Wellborn was still growing by the early 1900s. It was incorporated as a town. So it was no longer just an unincorporated community. It became the town of Wellborn in 1903. They had their own mayor, town council, marshal, clerk, tax collector, tax assessor, treasurer. In 1907, they amended the charter, taking into account some of the changes in the laws of Florida. In 1910, there was a place called McLaren's Park, somewhere maybe like a park area, where a lot of folks would meet together, including the Wellborn camp of the Woodmen of the World. I found some references to that. So I'm not sure, I have to go back, maybe do some digging and maybe find it, but probably some open area just around downtown Wellborn, I'm guessing. Wellborn's first bank was established in 1910. It had $15,000 capital. The officers were Dr. G.B. Smithson, A.W. McLaren, E.H. Pritchard, Dr. J.E. Pennington, E.B. McLaren, W.E. Denard, and B.N. Blanton. The vault fixtures had actually been over in Live Oak at the commercial bank. They basically sold those as they got a new one in. It's like, hey, y'all can have it in Wellborn. So they used those vault fixtures and used it for many years. A new building was under construction by early 1911, according to the records, and was open for business about April 1st. And that building lasted for many decades. It's gone now, but it was there for a long time. So by 1919, some of the businesses in Wellborn I was able to find some records of were Dr. J.E. Pennington's Drug Company, Lot Green's store, Kennedy's Barber Shop, and the Mosley and Harrell store. And there was also what was called a Delco lighting system in downtown Wellborn in that year. And according to the Suwannee Democrat newspaper, it said it had a city-like appearance because of it. Left is E.B. McLaren's home that's still around today, built in 1909. And then on the right is a picture of the Delco lighting system. Basically, it used glass batteries, they're on the right, a bunch of glass batteries, with a kerosene or gasoline generator, if you will, produce electricity. Basically, then just run power lines to whatever fixtures you had that needed power. So a light bulb or farm implements, those kinds of things. Basically, it's how you had electricity on farms before the county got electricity. So it was used for many decades in some places in Suwannee County. The 1920s, this is a picture showing the county in 1920. Some of the communities are going away as there's more and more automobiles. You've got easier travel. So these little communities that had existed are no longer needed. They're moving into bigger places like Live Oak, Branford, even Wellborn to an extent. I found some records from a May of 1920 election in Wellborn, showed that J.M. Hembry became mayor. Mallory and Hemming were tied in the race for clerk, and that'd be run again in a different election. J.W. Morgan was the elected marshal. I.W. Chandler and D.E. McDonald were elected to the city council. And they also had an executive committee that was W.P. Moore, J.E. Wise, and A.W. McLaren Jr. So the McLarens, again, they keep popping up in the records in the early 1900s especially. Unfortunately, because of a lot of different things going on, reduction in the number of cotton gins, which is because of the boll weevil that hits in about 1917, I believe it finally gets here. It basically wipes out our cotton crops. So cotton had been our main moneymaker in Suwannee County for decades by that point. When the boll weevil strikes, it wipes that out pretty much to zero. There's a little bit, but 95% of it is gone, and there goes all that money. And so we don't have as many cotton gins. A lot of the timber in the area has been cut out, so the lumber mills are shutting down. Same thing with turpentine steels. So the population is shifting elsewhere, especially South Florida, which by that point has been opened up by railroad, by the Flagglers and whatnot, to be able to access that place that the Seminoles lived in because nobody else wanted to live there. Well, people wanted to live there now. And so a lot of folks moved, and because of that, the town of Wellborn unincorporates in 1928. In 1951, they talk about reincorporating, but obviously did not. If they did, it was a very short period of time. But they were still doing things. 1922, the Wellborn Masonic Lodge built a 2-story lodge hall. Other businesses in 1922, chicken and eggs produced by A.W. McLaren Company. There was Cobb and Knight, there was S.G. Adams, Fletcher Brothers, W.I. Carver and Company, Harold Mosley. Several businesses still in Wellborn in the 1920s. The Wellborn Bank, which had been established in 1910, in 1928, the owner, who is Dr. Smithson, sells it to former Governor Kerry Hardy of Live Oak, and basically he's president of the commercial bank at that point. And there's a stipulation: we'll sell it to you, but our cashier, Merle Jernigan, has to continue his position in Live Oak. So that's basically what they did. On Christmas Day, they moved to Live Oak and reopened the next business day with Merle Jernigan as the cashier. And that's, again, the home of E.B. McLaren, who helped start that bank. I didn't have any other picture of it, sorry. Stock market crash in 1929. We're already being affected because of the boll weevil, all those kinds of things. So it hits us, but not as hard as other places. This is a map from 1932. A lot of those small communities are gone. You still see a few railroads around. The Great Depression is in full swing. 1935, a cannery was set up in Wellborn to help take care of those who were in need. So it was canning 200 cans every 8 hours to help folks preserve food for the hard times. 1937, before that point, they had started work on a new junior high school in Wellborn, but they didn't have enough money, so they had to stop. 1937, they continued completion of it, and it's completed later in the year. Farming, Suwannee County in the 1930s still had 3,000 small farms, even with the Great Depression going on, including the Wellborn area. Map of 1946, lots of details, but it shows you every road, and if you zoom in, you can pretty much see all the houses, churches, all that stuff. You can't see it on this view. Very interesting. But you still see Wellborn there on the right-hand side along the railroad. With Live Oak there in the center pretty much. All the rail lines pretty much going into it. In 1941, December 7th, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, we had a lot of farmers that signed up to go to war. 50 to 70% of our farm hands enlisted for not just the military, but for war-related purposes. But despite that, they were still gathering tobacco in the area, which had become the cash crop after cotton. And a lot of services were being provided. So that's a late 1980s or so photo of one of the Live Oak tobacco barns. Mr. Moore, Cecil Moore there on the right, smoking. Rationing was instituted. Same thing happened in the Wellborn area. The home demonstration clubs basically went around communities and they would show folks how to better can things, preserve things, making mattresses with what you had, like moss, those kinds of things. Don't use it for toilet paper if you have to, though. All I've heard stories from my family, but do what you need to do when you're poor. That's a map from 1958 showing again the major communities, along with some of the major products that we were producing. Wellborn was still there. 1951, as I said earlier, Wellborn was voting on whether to reincorporate. I haven't found the results, but I'm guessing it's a no, because I don't have any records of them ever reincorporating. Late 1950s, we have North Florida Telephone Company located in Live Oak. They're expanding into the rural areas. So presumably this is when Wellborn got telephone service. We've got some of those switchboards at the museum. So if you haven't been, you can see them. 1950s, more modernization. The old power plant in Ellaville, where I had some family work for many, many decades. But that was built, $6 million plant, and that allowed basically all of Suwannee County to get power for the first time, presumably including Wellborn. The next several pictures I'm going to show you, most of them are coming from a gentleman named Kenneth Thrower, who brought me these pictures probably 15, 20 years ago now. But they show Wellborn in the 1965, 66 era. So this is the downtown area with the old rail depot there, and the post office, little post office there on the side. This is another photo, same time, showing the Wellborn doctor's office to the left, and the barber shop, then the pharmacy, and then the bank, the brick bank that was built that we were talking about earlier. They're on the far right. And this is north of the railroad track, just north of the railroad tracks in Wellborn. As I mentioned, at one point in Suwannee County's history, we had like over 100 schools. Most of them one-room schools. They began to consolidate after automobiles were built and better roads were built. And Wellborn was one of the last schools to remain. By 1960, there were only 7 of them. Wellborn was one of them. But the last school year for that was 1966, 1967. So that's basically the last class for, I guess that's 5th and 6th grade. Looks like that was the last 5th and 6th grade in the school in Wellborn. By the 1970s, you've got Interstates 10 and 7. Whoa. That does not look like that on my map. Okay, well, this is a Picasso map, painting of Suwannee County. So that is weird because it pulled up just fine on my printer this morning before. Anyway, just picture the map of Suwannee County, like those other ones. But now you've got Interstate 10 and 75 running there. Yes, okay. So we've got 10 running here, 75 up here in the corner. Picture that map, but better. That is weird. Although Picasso got a hold of it, that is weird. Anyway, so those interstates start drawing traffic away from downtown Live Oak, but also downtown Wellborn, because now you can go quicker. You don't have to go through 90. You can now go I-10 or I-75 and go places a lot quicker, although I'm not sure where somebody wants to go on that map. But that does bring in other businesses, other places. In 1986, the state begins construction of a new state farmers market just outside of Wellborn, just off I-75, allowing broader access to farmers. Nowadays, though, it's pretty much used as a staging area for hurricanes and natural disasters. Next few pictures are taken in 1989, and that was the year it snowed in Suwannee County. I was like 11 and a half, I remember it. That was the last time until, what, 2 years ago we had some snow? But the last time we had enough to barely cover the ground. I remember going out, because it was around Christmas time, we didn't have mittens, we're from Florida. So we put socks on our hands, and we would make snowballs, but it's mainly dirt with a little bit of snow on it. But this is showing several pictures here, the next few pictures, showing Wellborn. So that white is snow. That's the George Walters house, which is south of the railroad tracks, just west of CR 137. Here's the CA Night store. That was the game room at that point. That's the Pasco Jarvis house north of the railroad tracks. That's the old millinery in the house behind the post office. That's downtown, if you will, Wellborn looking south of the railroad tracks. You've got the Wellborn cold storage, which burned, the Jiffy store, which has since closed, and at the time, Cornucopia Antiques there, close to the railroad. That's another picture of it again, 1989 with the snow there. So we went from snowing in 1989 to flooding in 1998. So that's some of the flooding in and around the Suwannee River and the Suwannee County area. This is looking west to 137, the railroad crossing, and the old stores that are in the right background that I was just showing you pictures of. Pretty much that's them. This was from 2006, showing some of the same buildings we've been talking about. McLaren stores there on the left. The Cash Mercantile store was next. The George Walter Storage Building, and then the C.A. Knight store. Those that you're seeing, those are the four. And then today, Wellborn is still quiet, residential. It's got the annual Blueberry Festival, which I guess was pretty recently held, a couple weeks ago, I think. And that brings in lots of people. A lot of houses, a lot of buildings have been destroyed by fire, by demolition over the years. Still got several historic buildings there. Pretty much those that I just showed you are still there. And again, a major attraction is the Blueberry Festival. Last weekend or the weekend
Last
before?
weekend.
Last weekend, yeah, I knew it just happened. So, because there was the Blueberry Festival, I think Jasper helped have the Blackberry Festival. So if you like berries of any kind, you have places to go. So pretty much Wellborn today, very relaxed, very rural, very friendly. You know, a few stores left, not near the heyday it was 100 years ago, but that's a lot of places in and around Suwannee County and throughout the state and the country for that matter. So, a few minutes after, sorry, any questions, thoughts, comments? Appreciate y'all's attention. If you got